people really misconstrue Cuban history. It's actually kind of confusing to me. I find that a lot of people who visit Cuba as tourists, they come back with a perception of Cuba that's given to them by their trip. And I think they associate, like, if they enjoyed themselves, they kind of then view Cuba through a rose-colored lens. And then couple that with what the media says about Cuba, what the media says about Cuban relations with the U.S. and how, most of the time it's kind of unfortunate. What you hear in mainstream media is you'll hear a lot of Cuba is in the position it's in because the U.S. still has an embargo on it, which has served greatly for Cuban dictators. They love the embargo. You think they hate it, they love it because one, they're still rich. One thing you guys have to know about the Cuban dictatorship and Cuban government, they still eat, guys. But as long as the embargo's in place, they have something to fall back on and say, well, the reason that our country's in the state it's in is because of the embargo. So they have a little bit of a meat shield in regards to that. And it's just interesting to me. And I was watching an interview with Martin R. Shankin, who is the senior editor at Cigar Aficionado, and I was having a cigar, and I watched, and he was talking to Michael Jordan about Cuba, and about if Michael Jordan wants to visit Cuba. Michael Jordan said, yeah, I'd love to visit. I really want to visit for the cigars, and I want to go to see the cigar factories. And I was actually kind of pleased with Michael Jordan's demeanor about it. He talked about there being some political restrictions, there being some general restrictions, and how his wife is Cuban. And it led me to believe that Michael Jordan has a little bit more educated an opinion on Cuba than I thought. I didn't take him to have that opinion, but then we find out his wife is Cuban, and that's really what did it for me. I'm like, oh, she's probably educated him a bit. Well, Martin R. Shankin decides to give his old man wisdom. He's been in and out of Cuba many times, as he said, of course, for cigar-related events, where he's probably going to the highest of highest clubs, and he's smoking the nicest cigars with all of the Cuban government or Cuban officials. And he says to Michael Jordan, if you went to Cuba, Michael Jordan, it would give the Cuban people, they would feel better about their self-esteem. They would feel better about about themselves as people. What? Where do you get that? That kind of idea, essentially he was saying that in order for Cuban people to have a higher self-esteem, they need Michael Jordan to go over there. Like his presence would make them feel better about themselves. It leads me to believe that Martin R. Shankin and people like him, people who go to Cuba to the tourist sites only and don't really have perspective about these issues, they don't interact with Cubans. They don't interact with the everyday Cuban. They might interact with people working or people in the tourist areas, but they don't interact with the everyday Cuban, the one who's struggling. They don't interact with any activists in Cuba, certainly, because they wouldn't have such a rose-colored view or such a weird view of Cubans. Cubans aren't generally super insecure that they need self-esteem boosts. What Cubans need is freedom. Freedom to do what they want. Freedom to make money. Freedom to have no upper limit or no real ceiling, or at least a higher ceiling on the financial opportunities. You can't financially bloom in Cuba. Even the people who are better off in Cuba, there's a ceiling for everybody. And here's the thing, you take a rich man in Cuba, a rich man. If that man decides to devote himself to activism, his life changes.